Hello, chess.com viewers. I'd like to welcome you back to another short series of videos. My name is Simon Williams, so you may have seen some of the other videos I've done for you so far. Some ideas in the Budapest Gambit, also on attacking play. And this short series we're going to do now of 5 videos is going to be really a combination of looking at the classical Dutch, so a variation in the Dutch defence, which is one of the most aggressive ways of meeting 1d4 that I'm probably most famous for playing, and it's an opening that is a favourite of mine. I think it's a very good opening, a very aggressive opening. It's helped me personally to beat some of the had some of my greatest victories, should I say, in the world. I managed to defeat Gelfand just after his world championship match with Anand. So I think I was one of the first people, maybe the first person to defeat Gelfand with the black pieces after his match with Anand for the world championships. That was in the Dutch defense. In the game we're going to have a look at here, I'm playing the very strong Polish player, Wojciech, who's actually Anand's second. And so that's I've had good results against the Anand family. And Wojciech is 27-20. And in this game, I completely destroyed him in 20 moves with this very interesting opening that we're going to look at. So, as well as looking at Dutch defense, I also want to combine this with attacking ideas and when it's a good idea to push for the attack. Because in most of these games, the opening has started off with the Dutch, and that it's a very solid and good opening. But at a certain moment, I've just gone for the attack. So I think this is also going to combine elements of when to attack, in what positions you should attack from, and when you know the basis of a good attack. So the classical Dutch is an opening. Well, there's 3 types of opening Dutch. So let's just have a look at the first move. So d4, and now the Dutch proper is played with one f5. So this is the way you normally enter into the Dutch opening with black. And it's quite interesting because not many people play the Dutch. But if you think about the most popular opening against one e4, so if you think after e4, what's black's most popular reply here? Well, e5, obviously, but the other most popular reply and the most aggressive reply is c5, the Sicilian. And really, what you're doing when you're playing the Dutch after d4, f5, you're playing really a reversed Sicilian. If you think about the pawn movements there, this is kind of similar to a Sicilian. So it's a very aggressive opening in its nature. And already you're trying to gain control of the central square. Now, I always play the Dutch defense after d4, well, not always, but most of the time by playing one e6 first. Now, you might think, well, why do I play one e6? Well, after one d4, f5, there are a number of sidelines and gambit lines which you have to be well prepared for. For example, there's the Staunton Gambit, which I know Thomas Rendell has done an excellent video on for chess.com, which is very dangerous unless you know what you're doing from black. And there's just lots of moves that black has to be wary of. So an interesting move order after one d4 is a move order one e6. Now, the only downside of this move order is that you have to be prepared for e4. And here, your best option is obviously to enter into a French defense with d5. And this, again, might not suit everyone. So if you're a French defense player, though, this would be, I think, a very good way of starting the game, one e6. So it's just a slight move order nuance. Okay, and now there's lots of different setups, and what we're going to really consider in these first 5 videos is just the main setup from white. So this is the theoretically recommended setup from white. This is what I get in most of my games, and this is what we're really going to concentrate on. And the setup in question is with knight to f3 here, and now I enter into a Dutch defense. So of course I play f5. Now, White's move order can be different here. White could have gone c4 last move. He could have gone g3. As black, you always have to be very aware of your opponent's move order. So do not play quickly in your opening, in the Dutch. If your opponent plays something you're not maybe expecting, that'd be a good moment to slow down and just try to think, well, they've played something different here. Can I still get my normal move order? Now, I'm just going to tell you what we're aiming for as black already on move 2. Now, your setup you're aiming for with black in the classical Dutch is with knight to f6, bishop to e7, castle's kingside. And now, rather than the stone wall Dutch, in the stone wall Dutch, you put your pawn on d5. In the classical Dutch, you put your pawn on d6. So this is your standard setup. So your standard setup, we normally go knight to f6 first. And then once we play knight to f6, we go bishop to e7, so we're able to castle. Once we've got the knight and bishop out the way, we can then castle our king. Once the king is castled, we put our pawn on d6. And one of the main ideas of the classical Dutch is to push forwards with e5 later on. So this is one of the main ideas in the classical Dutch. But so to do this, you prepare it with d6. Okay, well, let's see how the game continued here. Way to check my very strong opponent to play g3. And this is considered the main setup from white. White will often fianchetto his bishop on g2 and try to gain control of the center like this. Now, other setups we will consider in a new series of videos, but I think this is the most common setup, so we'll get used to the main ideas in black here. So now I continue the plan I mentioned before. My opponent also develops, so I play bishop e7, both sides to castle. My opponent now plays c4, which is the standard move, gaining space in the center with the pawns. And now, unlike the stone wall Dutch, we play d6. And this is the main, I should say, starting point for the classical Dutch, this position. In the classical Dutch, here, we have our pawns on d6, e6, and f5. Now, it may look a bit cramped, so let's just talk about the main ideas here for black. Well, some of your main ideas, your main strategical idea, you can't achieve this immediately, but your main strategical idea is to break with e5 at some moment. And you'll see that in this game, this idea works perfectly. So e5 is your main strategic idea, gaining very strong pawns in the center of the board. And if you compare this position after you get e5 in, it's actually very similar to a reverse Grand Prix attack. Any players out there who know the Grand Prix attack from the white side, this is actually very like that position, but from the black perspective. Now, other ideas you try to do very common in this opening is knight to e4. This is one idea I'm going to suggest you try to play in a lot of positions. And after knight to e4, you try to follow this move up with bishop to f6. And you'll slowly see that these rather passive pieces on f6 and e7 suddenly take up very good squares. So the knight on f6 jumps into e4. The bishop on e7 jumps into f6, trying to attack along this diagonal. Later on, we'll see in my game against Gelfand this idea working very well. You also often play the move a5 to try to gain space on the queen side to hit out against the b4 square. And one very typical idea, which is the main idea in this game, is the idea of queen to e8 to h5. And this is a caveman style chess. You may have seen my caveman commentary before. And this is basically a caveman idea, a very, very important idea in the classical Dutch. Try to put your queen onto the h5 square and to start an attack against the white king. Now, the ideal setup would be queen on h5, pawn on e5. So just try to picture this happening in the future. Obviously, white gets some moves as well. Pawn on f4, and the bishop on c8 then comes jumping into the game to h3, and your knight on f6 comes to g4. Now, that's a lot of paint on the board I've got there, so we'll just get rid of all this paint on the board, all these diagrams and arrows. But if you can just see, those are the main ideas. And I think when you're learning an opening, the main ideas are more important. So generally, do not worry about your bishop on c8 and your knight on b8. Leave these two pieces on their starting squares. These two guys can get developed later on in the game because you don't have to worry about them too much. Now, one thing you also have to be careful of doing is playing knight c6 too soon. If you play knight c6 too soon, it will allow your opponent to go d5, attacking your knight. And this is something you want to avoid. Now, after the move I played, d6, if white plays d5 here, which he doesn't actually play in the game, this would be a strategical mistake from white. Now, you can already maybe ask yourself why from the hints I've given you in this introduction to this game. What is one strategical idea that black's trying to achieve from this opening? Well, the idea is e5. And if you can achieve the move e5, this helps your position greatly. It now supports the f4 break, very important idea, and the caveman attack of going queen e8, queen h5, f4, bishop h3 is that little bit easier to achieve now. Your opponent's actually just helped your plan. So this would be a mistake, this move d5 from white. My opponent played queen to c2. A logical kind of move. White's strategical break is e4. You want to try to aim or stop this break e4. I played a move on the queen side now, gaining space on the queen side, something I mentioned briefly, a5. My opponent develops his knight to c3. It's a very logical play now. And in this position, my opponent is preparing to play the move e4. Now that his queen's on the c2 square, I'm able to play knight to c6. And this is a move that works out very well, because if my opponent now plays d5, his queen is slightly exposed on c2. So how can you get that strategical position that we mentioned early with your pawn on e5? Well, you can get that position by playing knight to b4, attacking the queen. Now, if the queen was on d1 in this position, white would have time to destroy your pawn structure with pawn takes e6, but this is not possible here. After queen b3, you can now go e5, and you've gained, again, your ideal pawn structure. So this is exactly the kind of thing you should be aiming for. Okay, so let's just go back. So d5 is a mistake here. Now, if your opponent plays e4 here, the way you need to meet this is with e5. One thing that's you have to try to get e5 in at nearly all costs. Now, one thing worth mentioning very quickly, the position you will always want to avoid in the classical Dutch is a position where you take on e4, your opponent captures on e4, everything gets exchanged on e4, and you reach this kind of pawn structure. Now, if you're not able to break with e5 in this kind of position, then you have a very big weakness on the e6 square, and white is clearly better in this type of position. So this is something you always try to avoid. So whenever your opponent plays e4, always be ready to meet it with a move e5. Okay, in the game, my opponent played b3. So this allows me to now play my strategical idea, e5. My opponent now captured on e5. Opening up the d file, I recapture back my pawn, so I have these two strong pawns in the center of the board. My opponent played what looks like a natural move, rook to d1. But of course, this allows me to accelerate my attacking idea now. Queen to e8. My idea, as I mentioned before, queen h5, f4, bishop h3, checkmate. Checkmate is the end of the game, so no messing about here. My opponent now played knight to b5. And here, we now come on to an attacking aspect of the game. And this is the position I kind of mentioned. As well as being theoretical, it's really, I thought now it's time to launch an attack at all costs. So it's really an all-in move, a very committal idea I now played. I actually let my opponent just take my pawn on c7 and take my rook on a8, because I thought my attack was going to be very strong here. And I think it's a very interesting idea what I did. Rather than defend against my c7 pawn where I lose tempo, I thought my attack combined with the idea of queen here, bishop on c5, pawn on f4 was going to be extremely strong. So I gave up all material on the queen side just to gain tempo. And this comes to timing in chess. I think it's very important to gain as much time as you can when attacking. So I simply play queen to h5 here, going for the caveman attack. My opponent obviously took on c7, winning a pawn. And now I played pawn to f4. So not even worrying about my rook on a8. And the point is here, I'm just ignoring my opponent's plan and I'm trying to gain as much time as I can to launch an attack myself. It's all about timing. My opponent's a much higher rated player than me. So I thought it's a good idea just to attack him. Again, if you're playing someone higher rated, then I think it's a good idea just to throw all your bits at his king. My opponent now took on a8, and I got another piece into the attack, bishop to c5. And even though I'm a whole rook and pawn down, I now have some very strong threats against my opponent's king on g1. My bishop on c5 takes up a very good attacking square, attacking against f2. My bishop on c8 can come running in to try to get rid of the defender on g2, his defensive piece there. My knight on f6 is ready to jump into the game to g4 when there's pressure against f2 and h2. My pawn on the f4 square can take in the apart by taking on g3. My rook on f8 can even play a part in the attack. So all my remaining pieces, even my knight on f6, on c6, which can come to b4, have a very good attacking role here. And this is another thing when you're trying to start an attack, it's about timing, but you need to look at the potential that your pieces have. And in this position, my pieces have a lot of potential. They have very good squares they can jump into. They have very good attacking squares. They have very good rolls. So I thought this is worth time. Now, in the game, my opponent already blundered under pressure already with rook to d5. And we'll come back to this quickly. Now, I think a critical variation here would be something like, I'm just going to show you one line which shows the dangers to white's position. Let's say my opponent now play knight to c7, which looks a perfectly logical move, trying to get the knight back into the game, maybe to d5, etc. Well, here I can play knight to b4 first, and this really comes back to the principle of thinking of what piece is not taking part in the attack. Well, I've pointed out nearly every piece, and after knight to b4, well, this piece now takes a very good role in the attack, attacking the queen. Now, one interesting variation here, if queen to c3, this does allow bishop takes f2 check. And in this position, if king takes f2, knight to e4 check, very dangerous for my opponents. So instead, queen to b2 looks more sensible. But now all our pieces start rocking and rolling here. When you're attacking, when you're material down, it's so important to keep the initiative up. You have to keep attacking. And this is one example of this. Knight to g4. Pressure against these two squares. No time to take a break. Have to keep going forwards with our pieces. And now let's say knight to d5 was played, trying to get the knight back into the game. Well, now I think a very interesting line would be bishop takes f2 check. The king is very badly placed on h1 because then I just continue pawn takes g3. So let's say he tries to run away, king to f1. Now, again, look at the pieces that are not taking part in attack if you cannot see an immediate win. Well, the rook on f8 is not taking part, so pawn takes g3 looks very logical. And now, well, this pawn's getting very dangerous, so white should probably take back the pawn. And here, well, a good move here and probably a winning move is bishop takes g3 when the attack is just too strong here. You can try defending this at home if you want to have a look at this position at home, but actually a much more attractive and beautiful way to play this position, and a way I've won this position before, would be queen to h2. And this, look at this move. I think it's an absolutely stunning and beautiful move, a really amazing move. And one of the ideas behind this move is we're just trying to get all our pieces into attack. And this is one thing you need to look at when you attack. And clearly, knight takes h2 does not work because knight takes h2 checkmate. Believe it or not, unbelievable queen sacrifice. And now, well, I actually had one game here where my opponent continued with a3. Now, viewers, can you see black's idea behind queen to h2? It wasn't just a pretty queen move where the queen comes in and aims to come to some square. It had some real good idea behind it. So checkmate in two moves now. Queen to g1 check. Lovely queen sacrifice. Only one move. Knight takes g1. We've now made a square for our g4 knight. So knight to h2 is checkmate. I think a very beautiful checkmate there. And again, we can just see how dangerous this attack can be. So the openings actually worked out very well. I'll show you the rest of the game very quickly. My opponent literally cracked from what happened from this real strong attack I gained. And it just shows you how dangerous this opening can be if one of the top players in the world doesn't know how to handle it. Well, my opponent continued rook d5, trying to give up material. But the game ended very quickly. Knight b4, getting another piece into the attack. My opponent tried to give up his rook to make things easier, but now I just took a lot of material. Won't go into the complications too much because the position quickly simplifies. His rook on a1 is attacked, and now I'm not even material down. So knight takes g3, and still I'm attacking even though the queens have been swapped off the board. And after rook b2, bishop to f5, my strong opponent resigned and moved 20. His knight is being attacked. It's equal material. And I'm also threatening to go knight takes e2 check and knight takes f1. And I'm going to be a piece up very soon. So I think a good introduction to the classical Dutch there. A nice attacking game, I thought. And it was just kind of all in chess there. Now, just to talk about the key moments, when you're starting the game here, you set up with bishop e7, castles, and d6. We talked about some of the various ideas you had. Now, if your opponent's queen comes to c2, you can try to prepare the e5 move. So I went a5 first to secure a square on the b4 square. After knight c3, I now was able to play this move. And as soon as you're able to play e5, I've supported this move now with my knight. So e5 was played. And after my queen comes to e8, I had this very strong attacking idea of queen h5, f4, bishop to c5, followed up with bishop h3 and knight g4 with a very big attack. So a bit of a long video there, I'm afraid, but I hope you enjoyed that introduction to the Dutch defence, and I hope that's given you a good taster to what the Dutch defence can be. There'll be more videos in this series shortly, and well, I hope some of you are brave enough to play this in future.